The Kitchener stitch is a very simple way of finishing off a piece of ribbing. It's a way to have a bind-off edge that looks quite like the cast-on edge, which in this case I've used a tubular kind of cast-on, and I'll put a link below for a kind of very simple tubular cast-on hack, I'd like to call it, that my friend Mel showed to me some time ago. Of course, I don't know what I'll do with this little sample. It is quite small, but it's good for demonstration purposes. So follow along with me and you'll be on your way in no time. In order to do the tutorial, if you're doing this with me, you will need your knitting and both of your needles. You'll need a needle, simple tapestry needle, and perhaps a pair of snips if you wish. To get started, the first thing I like to do is we have to get our knit stitches on one needle and our purl stitches on the other. And to do that, especially on something small like this, I just like to pull my needles out and just sort of let the knits fall to the front and the purls fall to the back. And I'll just take one of my needles and slip my knits onto the front one and my purls onto the back needle. Of course, if you are nervous about doing that, feel free to slip them individually onto your needles one at a time. And then I'm just going to need a length of yarn about 4 to 5 times the length or the width of my little sample piece here. So I'm just going to snip off a length and get that threaded onto my needle. I always use this little handy device. I'm not as clever as some people that are able to just whip those things into place. Before we get into the pattern of this, it's helpful to point out that each stitch will get worked 2 times before it's pulled off of the needles. And there's a little phrase that bears memorizing. It's knit off, purl on, purl off, and knit on. So what we'll do first is, since we have to work the first stitches of each needle 2 times before we pull them off, we go into this knit stitch like we're purling. We just draw the yarn through and just kind of snug it up a little bit. And then we go into this purl stitch on the back like we are going to knit it. So we just go into just one leg of that stitch like we were knitting it. And that's really all the setup that there is. From that point on, we're going to use that mantra. We knit the knit stitch off. I can pull him off now. And purl this knit stitch that's left and leave it on. Snug it up a little bit. Then we're ready to pull off this purl stitch. So it's purl and off. Just pull your thread sort of up and under so it looks like it's in the right place, kind of on top of the work rather than onto the side. I hope you can see what I'm doing. But before we move back to the front, we are going to knit this second stitch and leave it on. We're going into it like we're knitting. And just kind of snug that up. Then we come to the front again, under the needles. We knit the first stitch off, going into it like we're knitting. And we can just pull it off and tighten it up just a little bit. And prepare the second stitch by purling, putting our needle in like we're purling, and leaving the stitch on. We go to the back stitch and purl that one off. Kind of snug up your stitch and go into the remaining stitch like you were knitting. Back to the front, we knit off, taking care that we don't have that loop stuck around the side. I just sort of bunch it up there and pull that stitch off. Kind of firm up my stitch a little bit, and then we purl this remaining stitch and leave the stitch on the needle. Back to the back, we purl this stitch and come off. And again, making sure our yarn falls neatly. And going between the needles here just to make sure we knit into that stitch and leave it on. Coming back to the front, we knit this stitch off. Just kind of firm that up a little bit. And before we go to the back, remember that we purl into that last stitch. We go to the back under the needles and we purl this stitch and pull it off. Make sure our yarn is at a good place to be snugged up. And finally, we knit off the last stitch. And just sort of tighten everything up. And you can see here that once we have woven in our edges, that this bind off edge appears to allow the knit stitches just to kind of roll around. Quite simply, that is all there is to it. Even on this tiny swatch, don't be afraid to do this. It's great. If you've spent time on a project like a blanket or a cardigan where anything will be seen, take the time to both bind on and cast off in the best way possible so that you're happy with everything. Thank you for joining me, and do check out the links below to some other neater knitting videos that I will be putting out, including the slip stitch selvage edge, the tutorial for the tubular cast on hack, and avoiding dog ears on bind off rows. Be safe, be healthy, and love each other. We need more of that in the world. Thank you.